I was just talking about Margaret Thatcher passing away, and it did call to mind an era of confrontation with between the West and communism. You know, the confrontation of the second big confrontation of the 20th century, and she was so instrumental in that. What do you think her importance is actually in the scheme of things?
To me, the importance has less to do with the Soviet Union and more to do with the sense that existed until she came to office in 1979 that the drift to the left is inevitable and permanent. I remember discussing this with my father when I was in college 10 years before that and saying it's never going to change. It's just always going in one direction. And then she came along and she stopped it and she reversed it with enormous success. So to me, she's a world historical figure for that reason. She showed that we don't always have to go towards the left.
Toward more and more bigger government and more government programs, which we're currently in the process of doing. I guess that's why you're mentioning this.
Exactly. Less liberty and more equality.
And it seems that there's a school of thought in the United States that this is an inevitable progress of the United States and that it's a good thing.
And she showed, I mean, she came along when Britain was at its bottom. Britain in 1979 was doing terribly by every index, and she turned it around. And as you mentioned earlier, there was an economic boom, but it was not just economics, more a sense that Britain had found itself again.
Yeah, more a moral purpose. And she spoke in those terms quite often, which is startling to the ear of modern America in terms of our politicians.
It was an inspiration.
Truly. Let's talk about your expertise and a specific part of this, because you've been studying Islam for a long time, and you've written many books about this. But I am horrified by the anti-Christian, the rioting, the killing, the burning of churches and villages of Christians in Nigeria, and then, of course, as we're seeing here, the Coptic Church, which is, of course, much older than Islam, in Egypt, churches being burned, people being killed, rioting. What is going on here?
And it's not just those two countries.
Yes.
Iraq, for example, and beyond. Well, Islam has two very, very basic important premises. And one is the superiority of male over female, and the other is the superiority of Muslim over non-Muslim. And so the Islamists, those who want to return to Islamic law and apply it its entirety, focus inevitably and all the time on these two points: male over female, non-Muslim over Muslim. And so what you're seeing in Nigeria, Egypt, Iraq, and beyond is Muslims asserting their superiority over non-Muslims. And it's extraordinary. It's taking place all over the world, and not just there, but also in the West. We see examples of it. And by and large, the Christian world shrugs and doesn't see this as momentous or threatening.
There have been many times in Western civilization when when I was thinking about Pope Francis and so forth, and some of and Pope Benedict, who had taken a name of a famous pope in earlier times, when there was a confrontation between the West and Islam. This has been going on for, what, 1,400 years or something? Yeah,
crusade versus jihad has been a very old thing, but we are no longer engaged in crusade. Muslims are still engaged in jihad.
And I'm thinking about the time we defended, though, at the gates of Vienna, and then Charles Martel and all of that, defended against these invasions.
But some Christians are still engaged in a version of crusade, and that would certainly apply to Nigeria. What you're seeing is a church burned down and then a mosque burned down. So you have a confrontation in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, which is a religiously motivated confrontation, which simply doesn't exist in the West. Put it differently, the various sects of Christianity, in particular the Episcopalian one, which are so flabby in a place like the United States, are very determined in a place like Nigeria. Very different religion.
And what's the issue then with the Coptic Church in Egypt? It seems like they've been suppressed for 1,000 years.
The Muslim Brotherhood, and more especially the Salafis who've now come to power, want to eliminate the Christians from Egypt. They don't want genocide, but they want them out. And what they're doing is they're sending a signal to the Christians of Egypt, time to go. And for the first time in their almost 2 millennium history, Christians are leaving Egypt in substantial numbers.
As they did from Iraq. We have a very big population of Iraqis here, most of whom are Iraqi Christians, who were there again in Iraq well before there was Islam.
In the last 10 years, the Iraqi Christian population has been reduced by 2/3, 3/4.
Wow. Now, looking at all of that, the Muslim Brotherhood and all of the things that go on in the Middle East, give us, and we've just got a couple of minutes, but give us an overview here, because we're on the cusp, it seems to me, of getting more involved in yet another war there in Syria.
I'm against intervention on the side of the rebels. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that the rebels are Islamists, are our deep enemies. The Assad regime is a horrific totalitarian dictatorship. There's nothing good to be said about either side. And therefore, what is best in our interest is to keep this conflict going, to keep them fighting each other rather than one side being victorious and being triumphant and making trouble for the outside world. So as the Assad regime declines, I'm in favor of helping it. I'm also in favor of trying to do everything we can to remove this battlefield from the cities. I mean, the real problem is that you have tens of thousands dead and millions with homeless and disrupted. So let the fighting go on. That's not our issue, but let it go on outside of the cities. We should use our influence to get the fighting outside the cities. But I don't think we should help the rebels, not at all.
Israel appears to be now encircled. Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran through its puppet Syria, and other kinds of things going, other kinds of dynamics there. Do you sense they're more isolated than ever, or is that
Yes,
right?
They're more isolated, for example, from Turkey, which they had outstanding relations with a decade ago. But on the other hand, the Islamists are fighting themselves. Look, the classic two terrorist organizations fighting Israel were Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. Hezbollah and Hamas are now fighting each other in Syria. So Israel actually, for the meantime, has a reprieve. More generally, what one finds is that Islamists are fighting each other. Salafis and Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. I mentioned Hamas and Hezbollah in Syria and so forth throughout the region. So Israel is in a more precipitous environment, more dangerous environment, but at the same time, its enemies are fighting each other. So it doesn't have that much to do.
And at the same time, I would say, we only have 90 seconds, but at the same time, I would say that the Western influence everywhere, in Lebanon and Egypt and other places, is just receding. Seems to be evaporating.
It's self-imposed weakness that we have. I mean, we could be doing a whole lot more. We could be working with allies, but we've chosen not to. Leading from behind, I think, is the expression.